Now then, Boris Johnson, sometime between now and lunchtime, will be holding an emergency Cobra talks in Downing Street in an effort to avoid, quote, a disastrous, unquote, invasion of Ukraine.
It comes as the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss warned Russia could invade Ukraine at any moment and repeated a call for Britons to leave the country. Liz Truss joins us now. A very good morning to you.
Good morning.
Morning.
Obviously, there's a Cobra meeting going on. There's a lot of classified information that actually has been shared by the American intelligence agencies too, I think in a bid to warn everybody that this is imminent. There is slightly better noises coming out, aren't there, just in the last 24 hours from Russia. A sort of very bizarre situation where we saw Sergei Lavrov on a very long table with Putin at the end of it. What is your view at this point about the imminence of an invasion versus a window for diplomacy to bring us all back?
We still believe an attack on Ukraine is highly likely. That is what all of our information is showing us. And last week, both Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Putin said that they weren't planning to invade Ukraine. And yet we have seen 100,000 troops stationed on the Ukrainian border. And we know that any attack could be imminent. That is why we are warning British citizens to leave Ukraine while there are still commercial routes available. Nevertheless, there is a window for diplomacy. It is not certain there will be an attack, and we are urging the Russians to step back from the brink, to remove their troops from the border, because a war would be disastrous. It would be disastrous for Ukraine, but it would also be disastrous to the Russian people, because the Ukrainians will fight back. It will be long, it will be protracted, there will be numerous casualties, and it will have a very detrimental effect on the security of Europe. That is why the West has been united in putting together a tough package of sanctions, and that's what we've been talking to with our American colleagues, with our European colleagues, to really put that message to Vladimir Putin.
We were talking to Tom Tugendhat, a fellow Tory MP of yours, who's chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, for those who don't know. And he made a really interesting analysis that and he's an ex-military man, as you know, that it was a bit like, and I use this very carefully because he used it, that the Russians in this situation are like an abusive partner who are using the threat of violence, but really it's a really manipulative, psychological game of warfare that they're playing. And I mention that to you because, of course, you were in Moscow and you were insulted in public. I think we can hear this, just in terms of what their stance is. So let's just take a listen.
I'm truly disappointed. This is like the deaf talking to the blind. Basically, nobody is hearing each other. Unfortunately, our attempts to explain ourselves have fallen on deaf ears.
That was sort of an extraordinary way for somebody on a world stage to speak about their counterpart. A, how did you take that in that moment? And B, is there some weight to say that this is a psychological game being played out militarily, but truly it's a bargaining chip that they're doing here, but using here?
I went to Moscow to deliver a very clear message to the government and to the Russian people, which is there would be severe costs if there was to be an invasion into Ukraine. And of course, Sergei Lavrov didn't like the messages that I was saying. The Russians want to deny they have any intention of invading Ukraine. But the fact is, as I put to him at that very same press conference, why are there 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border if they have no intent of invading? And Tom Tugendhat is absolutely right. What the Russians are trying to do is they're trying to undermine Ukrainian democracy. They're trying to undermine the legitimacy of Ukraine. They've been carrying out false flag operations. They've been trying to install a puppet government into Kiev. And what we and our partners in NATO will do is continually call that out. And when the Russians resort to personal insults, it's because they don't have any positive points to put forward, because they know that their actions are aggressive and they are seeking to undermine Ukraine. And this is something that President Putin has been seeking to do for years. We saw the illegal annexation of Crimea. We've seen the aggression in the Donbass. And now is the time for the West to stand up to Vladimir Putin, to not give any concessions as a result of this aggression, and to make sure that we restore the European security architecture that has actually served us well for a number of years.
Can I ask you a very straight question about that meeting in Moscow last week? And I wonder if this explains why Lavrov's behaviour afterwards was so blatantly rude to you. Did you in any way, shape or form threaten them with attacking their gold and taking away their ill-gotten gains, which they launder specifically through London? Did you say to them that the personal consequences to the ruling elite there would be that they'd lose a lot of money if they carried on behaving like this?
So I had 4 hours of talks with Sergei Lavrov, and I made it very clear that, first of all, we would target oligarchs close to Putin. We would target banks and financial institutions. We would target energy companies, and that we were supplying defensive weapons to Ukraine to enable them to fight back. I also said to the Russians that they had reneged on their commitments. In 1994, they committed, when they signed up to the Budapest Agreement, that they would not threaten the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, which is now what they are seeking to do. So I put all of those points to Sergei Lavrov, and of course he didn't like them. But the reality is the only thing that Russia understands is strength. And we have to work with our NATO allies to put across those strong messages.
Right, but we have been, you talk about strength, and I think that is the point. We've been weak, haven't we, in trying to get rid of illegal Russian money that is here. It props up the property market, inflating it beyond the reach of most people. You know, they are invested in London, and a lot of it is illegal money that is laundered through London. I mean, Tom Tugendhat made that point. He said Sergei Lavrov would have mocked Liz Truss less if she'd threatened his gold, not just his integrity. How can it possibly be seen that they believe you when they say you're going to come down hard on them, when it's been going on for decades and nothing's ever been done about it?
Well, the day I was in Moscow with Sergei Lavrov is the day that we laid new legislation in Parliament, enabling us to take action against any interest that is directly relevant to the Russian state. And that applies to companies, it applies to individuals, it applies to oligarchs close to Vladimir Putin. And that is the point that I made to Sergei Lavrov. And that is the point I also made to the Russian people, because part of the purpose of my going to Moscow is to persuade the Russian people that they should not be backing their government. We have no issue with the Russian people. We are concerned about a government that is expansionist in its intent, that seeks to undermine the democracies on its border, and we are going to call it out. And frankly, I don't care what insults are levied at me by Sergei Lavrov. I will carry on making the same point.
One last question before we let you go. If this was the pre-nuclear age, things would be much simpler, wouldn't they? But the fact of the matter is that both sides here, in terms of the main players, have the bomb. And that changes everything. Do you feel to some extent that the West's hands are tied, or at least we have one hand behind our back? Because there's only so far we can go in confronting Russia before the thing escalates to a terribly dangerous level.
I don't see that as being the particular issue here. I think the issue is that the uncertainty over NATO membership and the fact that the Russians are claiming that Ukraine can't be a member of NATO is the problem. And I think that is the issue we need to resolve. We need to be clear.
And is that about saying we will block it? I mean, I know Angela Merkel blocked it.
No, on the contrary, we need to be clear that it's a sovereign decision for Ukraine and NATO, and it is not Russia's decision about how the countries near Russia defend their own security.
No, but
this is another point I made to Sergei Lavrov, that Russian security is not at risk. No one thinks that Ukraine is trying to invade Russia.
No.
It's very clear who the aggressor is in this situation.
But
I would agree, by the way, with Tom Tugendhat, is that the West has not been strong enough over the past few years in response to Crimea. And this is why we need to be very, very tough in the sanctions we're putting forward. That's why we're coordinating with our allies on these sanctions. That is why we're supplying defensive weapons into Ukraine. But there is no doubt that this is a very perilous situation we find ourselves in.
But very, very quickly, because we're almost out of time, surely there'd be a collective sigh of relief in Washington and in London and in Germany and in France and in the West generally, if the Ukraine said, you know what, we won't apply to join NATO. We'll put that on hold indefinitely. That would solve the situation, would it not?
No, it wouldn't, because Vladimir Putin has been very clear that his intention is not just to stop Ukraine joining NATO. He has said that the Ukrainian government is illegitimate. They've described the revolution that took place as a coup d'etat, and they are doing everything they can to try and undermine Ukraine and bring it into the sphere of Russian influence. So it would not stop at Ukraine not joining NATO. This would simply give succor to Vladimir Putin, who is using the threat at the Ukrainian border to try and gain concessions. And I think it would be very wrong to give any concessions in the face of aggression, because it will simply encourage more aggression from Russia and indeed other aggressors around the world.
All right, well, there I'm afraid we must leave it, but we do wish you the very best of luck in resolving this and averting a nightmare, because we just can't have this happening in Europe in 2022. But thank you very much for your time.